Welcome to People I Think Are Cool. I'm Liz Reed, one part of the art duo Cuddles and Rage, and co-creator of the graphic novel Bites of Terror. And this is my podcast to interview cool, interesting, creative people. Today on the show, I have Jane Friedman. She is the author of this amazing book, The Business of Being a Writer. It's one of those books where you'll always find something to pull from, whether you're new or you've been published and been writing for years. So let's get to our chat with Jane Friedman. I am, for one, super excited that we get to chat because when I started my writing career, your website was like a gold mine of information for somebody who did not understand how to, promote herself when everybody celebrates, getting a book traditionally published, but then they don't know what happens next.
Exactly.
So for people who don't know your background, do you mind just sharing that with me?
So I started working in traditional publishing right out of college. So this is going pretty far back, late 1990s. And I stayed in traditional publishing for 12 years for my first round. And this was at a mid-sized publisher in Cincinnati, the great Midwestern publishing empire, as I call it. And most people know this particular company, not by its corporate name, which is F&W Media, but by the many brands that it's been responsible for cultivating. So one of those is Writer's Digest.
Okay.
And Writer's Digest is one of the divisions that I worked in. I worked in some others, and I oversaw books being published across 4, 5, 6 different imprints. But Writer's Digest was one of them. And so at my work through that imprint, that brought me in touch with a lot of people in the publishing industry, editors, agents, people who are on the service side, self-publishing companies, writing software companies, you name it. We were somehow involved in reporting on it or covering it or going to conferences. So a lot of my knowledge of the industry comes from those years at Writer's Digest, as well as just working in the publishing industry myself and acquiring books across all sorts of different categories. So after I left Writer's Digest, I took a little detour into university teaching. I thought that I was going to do that for basically the rest of my career, but I got offered another publishing job, and I thought, well, maybe I'm not done with publishing quite yet. And so I went back. This time I was working for a literary journal out of a university, the sort of journal that has a very tiny circulation, but has a very big reputation. Yeah. So everyone wants to get published by it, even though nobody is reading it, that sort of journal. So that lasted a couple years. I was mainly brought on to relaunch the digital presence of the journal because it had gotten behind. So we relaunched the website, we started digital subscriptions, we had a social media presence after a long dormant period. So I did that. And then after 2 years, I left and became a full-time freelancer. And so I've been more or less on my own since 2014. And my business model is a mix of helping writers understand the industry. I also continue to report on the industry. I go to the industry trade fairs like London Book Fair. And so, yeah, that's in a nutshell where I've been for the last 20 years.
Yeah. I mean, I'm surprised that it was just 2014. I feel like your information's been out there forever because it is like the Bible that people have to go to understand. Like I even have your book here. And
thank you.
Okay. I have your book. But your book is so good. Like I started off with like a soft listen, like with the audiobook that I got from my library. But then it was so, a book is good when you're like, I need the physical copy.
Yeah.
It makes a huge difference. So in writing your book, did you have your own personal writings as well outside of your career?
Yes. So like many people who write and publish today, I did get a degree in creative writing. So that's my bachelor's. I have a master's, but it's not in writing, it's in English. And I got that thinking, eventually I would teach writing at a university level. Or I would go on to get an MFA. I didn't really know. In any event, I didn't get an MFA, but I did do all sorts of creative writing in college and in my early years of publishing. But one of the problems unfortunately, with working in publishing, at least for some of us, is that it really kind of kills your creative desire to come home and start writing books or anything else for that matter. I mean, you're pouring your creative energies into other things. And I felt guilty and ashamed about that for years and years. And finally, I realized it was time to stop feeling guilty. I was just directing my energy in a different way. So, I didn't produce any of my own creative writing for a long time until I started blogging. And so maybe the reason you feel like my stuff has been out there for so much longer than 2014 is because I started blogging in 2008. And so I had a lot of material circulating for years before I actually did a formal book. A lot of that was, in fact, business or career oriented, but I also did a lot of personal writing during that time. Some of it got on the blog, some of it went in other places. I've published some personal essays that have nothing to do with writing and publishing. But the truth is, I still focus a lot of my energy, creative energy, on writing and reporting about publishing. So I haven't given myself a lot of wiggle room to do that other work.
Yeah. And what I think is fascinating, that actually like all writers should pull from, and I don't feel like newer writers like understand, is that like a lot of the stuff that you put out there was, free to the public.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so we got to know you before investing in you, which for my friends who ask about writing, they're like, oh, I don't know what I would put on social media. I was like, well, when your book comes out, then how are people going to know to like invest in you?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you talk about social media in your book, but I mean, how often do you, talking to new writers, hear them struggle with making that connection?
I hear about that struggle basically daily. And I don't know that it's age specific either. I think every writer, regardless of the generation they're in, thinks about how do I balance this social media or marketing or platform thing with the writing that I want to do. And part of it, I think, is actually just mindset or attitude, or you see so many bad practices on social media. And so you start to equate that with what is needed or required on social media or what it represents. And you can't judge it by all of the bad stuff that happens there. So I try to encourage people to think of social media as a way to practice your writing in short bursts. I don't want to call it a performance exactly, but you are putting out a persona of some kind, and you're deciding what you want to share, what you're going to make public, and how you're going to identify yourself. And it can be playful. It can be experimental. My husband, for example, he's not a writer. He's more into the music scene, but he happens to be a good writer. So he also has an interest in donuts. And when we moved from Cincinnati to Virginia, we realized we were in a donut desert. They're like, just the Midwest has a monopoly on good donuts, and it's really hard to get them. Like cream-filled Long Johns with chocolate.
I know, I'm in Maryland. Yes.
So you know the struggle. It's real.
Yes.
So he went on the donut odyssey, where he went to independent bakeries in the state looking for the Midwestern cream-filled Long John. Long story short, he didn't find it, but he did, have monthly updates on social media about his odyssey with photos and tasting notes, and he was clearly having a good time. Now, was he doing this to build a brand as the donut guy? No, he was doing it because it was fun. But the upshot was that within 3 months, he became the donut guy, and people were suggesting he start a podcast and maybe he should reach out to the Food Network, and making ridiculous suggestions like he's not going to start a career in this. But I like that story, telling that story, because it shows how quickly you can become known for something on social media, doing something you like, writing about it, and, having fun and entertaining people along the way.
No, it's so true. And I think the biggest moment in going through your book for me that I feel like people just do not get is the investment back into your community of writers or back into your community of artists. That, like people think of networking as, something gross to do, or people don't realize that it's a two-way street. It's about the relationship first, and then maybe possibly if something happens, like you shouldn't talk to somebody expecting something back.
Right.
So when did you put that together? I mean, it might come naturally to you, but in
Mhm.
looking in others trying to, build their community.
Yeah, I think there were two things at play for me where I was able to put it together. First, I started social media really early when it was, let's say, a more innocent place.
When Facebook was through colleges early, or
Almost that early, yeah.
yeah.
Especially Twitter, like Twitter in the late 2000s was a very different place.
Yeah.
And so I think at that time it had more of a community feel. There wasn't really a strategy or a marketing outcome that you necessarily expected. And everyone was kind of fumbling through figuring out what do I use Twitter for? It wasn't really clear what it was good for at the time. So part of it was just that newness and everyone kind of fumbling their way through. And I found that if I just leaned on my own inclinations, I like to help people. I like to inform. I like to serve. And so just felt natural to me to share things that I knew, to share links to other stuff. That's really how I felt most comfortable. But I think on the other side of it, I was also listening to people and reading books that I think really emphasize the community or the literary citizenship angle, if you look at it
Yes.
on the
Yes,
publishing
that's the
side.
term. I was looking for it. Yes, I
Yeah.
love that term.
So some of those early thinkers that are still around today, like Chris Guillebeau, who's written a lot about how to be basically a solo entrepreneur. There was Chris Brogan in those early days. There's also a book called Clue Train Manifesto, which is more of a marketing business book, but it was talking about how the internet and technology and social media really changes what it means to try and run a business, especially when it's the readers or the consumers or however you want to think about it. They have an active role in defining who you are through social media, which can be scary, but it's also powerful. In any event, I think literary citizenship, that's the term that usually makes sense for writers when they realize that if no one's out there talking about books or celebrating literature or reviewing, it's going to create a poorer culture. Imagine if every writer pulled back from social media and decided their time was only best spent writing books and they weren't going to show up and talk about books. That would be a tragedy. Like, we need writers to be out there sharing what's important to them and to the culture, which I think books, it's a huge deal for us, and we need to be out there evangelizing for them, or any type of writing, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, in your educating process of talking to people, I guess one thing that I didn't realize early on is how much power librarians have.
Mm. Yes.
And I just had no idea. I mean, you're always thankful for them, but they can be gatekeepers on if people get your book or not. Is that something that you talk about with traditional publishing? Because I know with self-publishing, that's kind of the downfall, is you can't really get into libraries.
It's tough. Yeah. Fortunately, just on the self-publishing library topic, I will mention there's something called the Indie Author Project, which is, I love this project. It's a partnership between several organizations with the participation of libraries that gives out an award annually to the best self-published novel in the state. There may be 16 states that participate. And then after all the states choose their winners, there's a national winner that's chosen. So that's something for you or your listeners to check out, the Indie Author Project. I think there are some library systems that are they recognize the power of self-publishing, and that a lot of underserved communities and people of color have to use self-publishing or have used it because traditional publishing just hasn't been as open to them. So I am seeing a lot of more of a welcome mat maybe than there has ever been before to self-published authors. But in any event, yes, libraries play a really important role in introducing books to people. And I think right now is a very interesting time during the pandemic. because so many libraries are limited in what they can provide at the moment, and they've had to go to their digital collections as a way of staying in touch with people or innovating in the sorts of services they provide. I know there was one library that decided to start a kind of like dial a story service where you could pick up the phone and dial a number and hear a story
Awesome.
in English or Spanish. I can't remember which library system that was. But yeah, so I've probably gone off on a tangent now, and there was a question I've now forgotten.
No, you've totally covered it. Because I just don't think people even piece together that their library is a resource for technology too.
Yes.
Absolutely. So many people haven't gone to a library since childhood, and it's definitely a completely different space. So you also do like consulting and like 101 stuff. I feel like now with everybody kind of like locking down, like, of course, there's so many people are like, I'm going to write my novel now.
Yes.
So has business been booming for you?
Business has been good. And it's something that I don't like to say too loudly because, people are struggling. And,
right.
I don't want to celebrate the fact that it's been a good business year when conditions are so serious for the country. But yeah, the truth of the matter is that professional people even people who've lost their jobs, people just generally have more time on their hands than they did before. Although there are a lot of factors like, do you have children at home? Are you taking care of family? People have really use this opportunity to get back to things they care about or to express realizations they've had during the pandemic. And it has resulted in much more interest in consultations and online education, and just trying to be either as a distraction, a needed distraction, or as just a way to do something that feels meaningful. I've talked to some other freelancers in the writing and publishing space, and they've seen the same phenomenon. So their business is generally doing well. And I think anyone who already had a pretty firm footing online, I think generally has seen an increase in business.
Yeah, no, and writing is therapy. So I feel like, giving people hope that they can do it by talking to you, because that's what I feel like in reading your book, even though I've done both worlds, traditional and self, you can still get lost. Even if you put a book out there, you could still be like, yes. What the heck? Especially if it doesn't sell, it can make you feel down. So I do feel like you're giving people that hope and helping them push forward, which is really important now that, like you said, it's an unfortunate time, but, this is a way to really give people something that they've been craving.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So one other part of your book that I loved is how you kind of went through the steps for people who want to be a writer, in terms of like trying to get traditionally published before trying to self-publish. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like that mindset might change at all? Because I watched this documentary on romance novels. Did you see this? Like Between the Sheets, or I think or Under the Covers. I don't know. It's one of those puns about romance. Right. And it made me realize that a lot of the romance novels that I love are self-published, but I had no idea. And, when you were talking about people of color, like that was a big part of that documentary in creating a space for people whose stories aren't often told. But it kind of flipped my brain on the new way of thinking about self-publishing. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm not really asking you a question, but do you mind just kind of going through those steps of, the going traditional route, and then getting down to self-publishing?
Right. Sure. The book that I wrote, The Business of Being a Writer, that specific book is, when I was writing it, in my mind was someone who probably came out of a creative writing program or might be more inclined to write, let's say, literary work, although I think the same principles apply regardless of genre. But that's kind of who I had in my head. And so that kind of informed the bias of the steps that I laid out, which is an assumption you will probably want a traditional publisher first, and then, which means an agent. And if you can't get an agent, well, then there are these small presses or independent houses that will take you without one. And then there's hybrid or self-publishing as a backup plan, or maybe you don't pursue it because you're just going to try to get your next book traditionally published then. So for anyone who wants a traditional publishing deal, like that's the dream, the editor who's going to nurture you, although that sometimes can be a myth at this point. I encourage people to try that, see if you can make it happen rather than self-publishing first and then backing your way into it with the same book, because it's so hard once you self-publish a book to then get it traditionally published. I just mean the same project. I don't mean that you can't move on to a traditional deal later. You can, but once the book's out, it's out. And an agent or publisher's interest in it will dramatically plummet if you've self-published it, unless you're, lightning strikes and you're on the bestseller lists or something like that.
Right. Like that people point to The Martian, right? That was one of those reverse
exactly.
ones. But you're like, that's 1 in a million.
Right. Yes, 1 in a million. Now with romance, here's a really interesting scenario, because it's a genre, like for me, the genre where I do think you're starting to see it flip. So it can make more sense to start out self-publishing, especially if you've got a series. Romance readers are voracious. They consume so many novels in the space of a year. They often belong to subscription services like Kindle Unlimited because they are voracious readers, and that's more economical for them to pay their $10 a month rather than pay, for all of the units that they're reading. So yeah, I could see for romance in particular, science fiction and fantasy, mystery, anything that's in a really strong genre, you can probably have success self-publishing if you're really focused and disciplined, meaning you're not genre hopping, you're probably doing a series, you're comfortable online. And then if you want to traditionally publish or do projects that with traditional publishers, that's certainly a possibility. So yeah, I think we are seeing different models evolve side by side. I don't think it's ever going to entirely move one way or the other. It's just going to depend on the type of book that it is.
Yeah. Another word that I hear coming up more and more is the novella. I feel like so many people are writing them because it is kind of easier to sell your novella versus being like, I'm a slow reader. Can you take a week, sometimes a month, to get through my book? Have you picked up on any of that buzz too?
I haven't heard much talk about novellas specifically, and I'm thinking of a very traditional novella, like a traditional publishing novella would be something you would produce in print, and maybe the novellas you're seeing are mainly digital first. I don't know.
Yes.
Okay. It may be kind of this weird in-between thing on our way to what I would call more interactive literature. So there are stories at Wattpad through an app called Tap. So these are stories that you tap through. I don't know if have you seen these?
No.
Yeah. So you might enjoy this. So for those who don't even know what Wattpad is, this is a fairly well-established site for reading serialized fiction for the most part. And it appeals to a younger audience, an international audience, a mobile reading audience. So most Wattpad fiction is consumed on people's phones. And so they've launched a separate service kind of parallel called Tap. So Tap is stories that you tap through, and there's some level of engagement there where like a choose your own adventure sort of stuff. And there's like a game aspect to it. And Tap's not the only game in town for that. There's some other services that do something similar. There's a service called Radish that I would say, it started out doing serialized fiction that I would say was kind of like a TV binge series model. They wanted you to binge the stories. Yeah. Now pivoted a little bit where they still have that kind of we want you to read and consume these in kind of a fast binge-oriented fashion, but there's more interactivity and just things to do and look forward to, something that's more engaging than I'm just going to read this on my Kindle for 30 minutes. So to me, that speaks a little bit to what you were saying about oh, it's only going to take you a week, or maybe it's only going to take you an afternoon, or maybe it's only going to take you 30 minutes to read the story, rather than asking someone for this huge commitment of time.
Oh my gosh, that's genius. Because, with Wattpad, I was doing a writer's panel, I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And somebody in the audience was like, what do you think about Wattpad? And we're like, I don't know what Wattpad is. So now I know it. I looked at it, but I haven't invested in it. Do you recommend that as a place to start or to play around in then?
Oh, I would definitely play around with it, especially if you're writing anything that would be in the romance area, things that appeal to YA readers. So genre fiction and youth are kind of like the things that you see most prevalent in these areas. That doesn't mean, though, that older people don't read them or that you can't do different things, but you might not have as easy of a time finding your audience. I see that some authors who, if they prefer doing more traditional book length work, they might use TAP to do like a bonus or a premium for readers on book launch. Here's this fun thing I've created where you get to be the protagonist and you can see kind of an offshoot of the story. But I think there are also people just using it to experiment and to try and earn money, but discoverability is a big issue on these platforms. So, if you're not working with them to market, like if they haven't selected you in some way, if they haven't approached you and say, you want to work with us, you might see that your stories kind of sink to the bottom, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of what's hard about your job is that people come to you with a dream. And you don't want to like burst their bubble, and you're like there is a way, but it's not. People want that magic ticket, and I today, researching, because you got to stay up to date. Like, you can't just assume that you're good, everything. I still search for the magic ticket, even though I know it's not there. So how do you answer that for somebody when you're kind of having to break their heart? That's like it's not as simple as that.
I look for what their motivation is. Some people's motivation is really focused on, I just want to write more stories, or I want to get better at telling them, or better at the craft and technique. Some people really desire to spread a message, and it actually has very little to do with publishing a book. And when you kind of point out that there are lots of easier ways to spread a message than to try and get this book published, they think, well, maybe I should do something else instead, whether that's a podcast or joining a particular group, or even just being active in your community. Like, there's so many ways to affect change aside from books. So I try to counsel patience as well. If you're doing something you enjoy and you want to improve at it, just try not to expect results overnight. I know we're kind of in a culture where we have this expectation that we're going to see progress right away. And with writing and publishing, you just don't. So it's a lot of small steps. And I think sometimes people put too much pressure on themselves to see those results very quickly, or they're comparing themselves to other writers and saying, look at how good they're doing, not seeing that behind that, there's been years of work. So comparing yourself is just going to, you're going to feel frustrated very quickly if you do that.
No, so true. I've gotten into listening to more music podcasts, like with bands, because then I'm not comparing myself to the same struggle. Like, they have to go around and promote their band because people don't just find them. But, and so I can take away from what they're doing and apply it to writing without feeling like crap at the end. So I have 2 more questions for you. And speaking about technology, like, I subscribe to your newsletter, and, you really hit it up. Like, you're always on the pulse about like what's new, what's to do. So how are you selective with your time in knowing what to invest in? Because I'm always on this podcast talking about TikTok, which that gets to my second question, because I feel like there's, find the gap where there isn't much of an audience and fill it, and then you'll be able to find them. But a lot of people are like, I don't want to waste my time with that. That's one more piece of technology that I don't want to invest in. So how do you manage that with your own personal use?
Yeah. It's very much driven by gut instinct, which is not going to be a terribly helpful answer. But let me describe what that means, and it might because I think you're in your own internal, if you're self-aware about your own attitudes or how certain media make you feel, it's instructive. So for instance, when I first got on Twitter ages ago, I did not get it. I fundamentally just didn't understand, and I left it. I didn't close my account. It was dormant. And then I went back to it a year later and started playing around and started some small efforts. And I caught on to something about what I wanted to do there. And it had to do with a weekly roundup of best tweets for writers. It was actually fun for me to do this. And it kept me informed about the community. It like pushed me to monitor certain parts of Twitter and pull out the relevant bits for myself, which I then shared with others. So part of what I was doing in my sharing with Twitter was I was already educating myself, and I used the byproduct of that to help other people. Very kind of similar thing with Instagram, and that I started on it in 2010. I dabbled a little. I kind of left it. I rarely opened it. And then I came back really strong on it maybe 2 years ago when I decided, you know what? I'm not journaling anymore. I'm not doing any sort of personal tracking. Like I feel like I was starting to lose like the daily texture of life, so that if I wanted to look back in 10 years and say, what did life feel like? I didn't have a record of it anymore. Mm-hmm. And so I decided I wanted to start using Instagram to remind myself of what the days looked like and what concerned me. And so it was more of a personal initiative, which occasionally business enters into that. And I talk about classes or I talk about conferences, but it's also a personal record. And it's become much more interesting to me when I found a purpose that I want to fulfill on it. And I think other people might want to join me along the way. Where did this question start?
Taking on new technology and deciding what's worth your time.
Yes. So I think you have to find that kernel of what is there that matters to you, what attracts you to it. And you may find that you engage with it and ultimately you can't, like you're repelled in some way, not like you're disgusted, but you're just like, it's not me. This happened to me with Pinterest.
Oh yes. So it's so complicated now.
It was clear to me, I have a market there. Like there's potential there. I like the third biggest social refer of traffic to my site is Pinterest. It's Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest. Instagram is like way, 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 way down on the list. But even though I put maybe 6 months of effort into it and I just hated it. And I thought, this makes no sense. Like, I don't care what the business outcome is. These other networks are good enough. So I think sustainability is really important and what's just going to resonate with you so that you'll stick with it.
Yes, because sustainability and consistency kind of go hand in hand. Like you can't just imagine to like pop up 6 months later and have people caring about what you have to say, which is it's unfortunate, but that's just, people's attention spans are just being pulled from everywhere right now. Yeah. So that leads to my last question. Is, you're talking about the instant reward. And so when I was thinking about TikTok, I mean, a lot of people can just go viral so easily because of that instant reward. Like we had that happen to us. And then I was like, oh man, will we ever capture that again? Like you have people who are aware of you now, but there's a sustainability there. So I guess what it does is like you get that little cookie and you're like, oh man, that feels so good. But then you don't get another cookie. And then you go, you feel like you're starving, but you need to keep motivated to push forward. So how do you have people like not think about the instant gratification, but yet reward themselves along the way?
That's an excellent question. When people, we're really talking about, internal versus external rewards. And external rewards aren't bad. You need them. You need the validation and also it's signs of progress. Like you've done something that resonates. And those are important signals that you can learn from and maybe you can duplicate, maybe you can't. I think if you get overly focused on the external rewards or those external signals, you can miss the internal reasons that you're producing the work in the first place, or what's driving you to create. So every time I've had one of these viral successes myself, whether it was a really amazing tweet or blog post or whatever, it was usually driven by something really emotional in me. Like there was something, and it could be fear, it could be anger, it could be excitement. It doesn't really matter, but it was just like there, you feel that burn, or there's the excitement of creating something that to you feels fresh and innovative. And then you can almost feel like this is going to do really well. Like, or sometimes it's something that has totally charmed and delighted you, and you think, well, this is going to charm and delight others. But you don't quite realize how much you've struck a nerve. Like I think one of my most successful tweets was just sharing an image of stamps, of things that, if you're an editor, things that you want to stamp on people's work. And they're really snarky stamps. And I shared that. It went crazy insane, and people wanted to buy the stamps that did not exist. Unfortunately, that was a business product. That was a product idea I missed the boat on. So in any event, there are these, I think that's when you get too focused on how can I, if you, it's really hard to reverse engineer that process. You know, you can't start with, how do I go viral? And then, okay, I'm going to create X. It has to start with, something inside that's exciting to you. Yeah. So I don't know if that really is a great answer to the question, but getting back to the work, focusing on the work to me, that's what you always do when you feel like you're getting pushed and pulled by external forces.
Yeah. And the running theme and your answers, which is so true, is just kind of focusing back on yourself. You can only control you can't control everything else. So I feel like focus your external output on, being a, like, what did you say, literature citizenship, yes. Focus on that. But then when it comes to yourself, just put out what you love.
I should add as a postscript to that is some people, like this, I guess in some circles, this might sound as like narcissistic or, or like navel gazing, or you're just going to talk about yourself on social media. And that's not really what I mean at all. But if that's how it's sounding, you can also focus on other people.
Yes, that is so true. That is. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, shining a light on what other people are doing, collaborating with other people, that's gold.
That is so true. And I feel like it also makes you feel better about yourself. In the end, you feel less gross than being like, me.
Exactly.
And it still introduces you to new people too. Like that's the beauty of it. It is both ways. Well, I love how thoughtful you are with your answers and with your writing. I feel like in talking to you in person, that you combine all this knowledge from all these different backgrounds that you've lived in and have put them all together for writers, which is really special. And so I hope, are you going to put out more books? Or
my dirty secret, I can't remember if I revealed this in the book or not, is that I don't like writing books.
No, what?
But I do have an idea for a book that I want to write, which I won't reveal here, but it's something that I'm hoping within a couple of years that I put out. Yeah.
Great.
It'll be quite different from what I've so far done.
Which I think is great. I mean, because when it comes to writing, I mean, I feel like your book is the only book that people need to read. Because, okay, maybe you might disagree, but because it really is the only one that puts together, you get a little bit of the dream and you get a little bit of the science, but then you get a little bit of the like common sense that's kind of hard to apply to yourself. Yeah. That's just what's beautiful about it. I haven't read any other book that's really filled my cup in the way that your writing has. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I couldn't hope for a better compliment. Thank you.
Oh yeah. I listen to all your podcasts too. I'm like, I want, whenever you're in an interview, I want to go back through that because even though it is kind of like the same lessons at times, because it is just like applying the same principles, you forget about it. You know, like you forget if you've been writing for 10 years and self-publishing traditional, like that's, you take for granted, like, what sparked you and what kept you going. So I feel like this is like a book that, like, I need to read every year or listen to on the audio version. So that is just as good. So, and this is just me gushing about you now.
Thank you.
Well, Jane, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. And I just want to say, this is a non sequitur. I love the little picture behind you.
Oh, wait. Oh, which one?
The My Hard Shell is the only thing keeping me together.
Thank you. That's one of our comics. I sold out of it during COVID, so I was like, oh, you guys.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. And I appreciate your book and your cat. What is it, Nylon Cat? Is that what it? Yes, because I get to see so much of your personality in there in the background. Is this your setup for your consulting too?
It is.
Yes. Yeah. You know what? Okay, I'll end it after more gushing. What I really loved about looking at your consulting side is that you have a video of how you're like, this is what it's going to look like. Mm-hmm. I love your transparency with everything, because it does make a difference. Like, if you're going to invest money in somebody, it's so good to know what you're going to get out of it. Which
reminds me, I need to update that video. All right, but there is a cat in it, so that stays the same for sure.
Yeah. You got to keep the cat. That's just adorable. Well, thank you again, Jane. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Jane for being on the show. Guys, go get The Business of Being a Writer, or check out the audiobook. That's how I do it sometimes whenever I'm revisiting it. There's just so much to learn from her, and I highly recommend you check out her website. All right, so here comes the time where I recommend my movie per episode. And today I want you to go check out the movie Spontaneous. You can rent it on iTunes. Jimmy and I checked it out, I think, a month ago. And it was one of those movies where it was weird and fun and surprising, and I ended up crying at the end. There's lots of blood and guts in a fun way, not in a crazy, scary way. If you're like, ooh, gross. Okay, it is gross, but it's like the best kind of gross. And like I said, it's a real emotional journey and hilarious and fun along the way. You don't really get that many gems like that. So go watch Spontaneous and let me know what you think. You can find me at Cuddles and Rage on social media. If you want to see what I'm watching or what movies I love, you can also find me at Cuddles and Rage on Letterboxd. So don't hesitate to reach out for a recommendation. As I always say, I'm like, I'll just tell you what to watch. Thank you so much again for tuning in, and I will see you soon. Bye.